Okay. I'm not sure that we're turning Bread and Rosaries into an ASMR podcast, partly because if you carry on making mouth noises, I'm going to throw up.
Seb has the same issue. He gets really angry as well.
Understandably, I get it.
I try not to because I know it's my problem, but I do genuinely want to punch people in the neck.
Misophonia, is it?
Yeah. I used to live with a guy, right? And I hope he doesn't listen to this podcast because I'm about to slag him off. But I used to live with a guy who... I don't know how he did it. The only thing I could think of is that it was deliberate, because he would literally, he'd eat breakfast like this. Like, this would be his cereal. It'd be... and then he'd slurp the milk and I would just be there on edge because I'd forgotten to quickly turn the radio on before I heard him coming down the stairs.
Yeah.
Anyway, shall we talk about postmodernism?
Postmodernism.
Fuck off, Jonny. Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that resents anything postmodern and, like the church, cannot fathom things that aren't at least a century old. I'm Adam Spears and I'm joined by Jonny Bell and Luca von Badass. Hello, Jonny and Lou.
Hello.
Hello.
Today we are talking about, well, apparently the episode title is Speaking Truth to Power, aka Postmodern Shit. I did not come up with that, so I'm just reading off the notes here.
I'm really surprised that you didn't come up with that title because it sounds really like you.
It actually does, to be fair. Why don't we, before we really go on to talk about all of this, why don't we start with what else is on my mind grapes?
What else is on my mind grapes?
I have one thing on my mind grapes today. I don't know if you two have anything on your mind grapes.
I've got the maggot story on my mind grapes because it's burnt into my retinas.
Okay. Should we start talking about maggots then, and then we'll move on to something else?
Yes, why not? So this isn't a news item, but it could have been local news if it got found out, because it was quite exciting. So basically, I was assisting with communion a couple of weeks ago, and there I was behind the altar, and I get past the ciborium with the wafers in, of course, all consecrated, all lovely. Went round to the front, ready for people to queue up, and just as the choir come forward to receive, I look down, and a little maggot has been eating through the wafers, like the very hungry caterpillar, like real perfect circles through the cross that's imprinted on the wafers. And I could see it wriggling its way, and I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I had to really fix my face, because I thought, if I react, this could, cause consternation in the congregation. So I wish there was like a video when people hear this. So basically, every time that I basically moved the maggot closer to the side of the ciborium so I could keep an eye on it, and sort of surrounded it with wafers it had already eaten, like a little cage, and then pushed the other wafers to the other side of the ciborium. And as I picked each one up, I kind of checked it over, looked it over a few times, and then passed it as body of Christ, body of Christ. And at the end, obviously you put everything back on the altar ready to consume. And my vicar kind of passed me some, and I said, don't eat it, don't eat it. It's there's a maggot in there. And he was like, what, a maggot? And I was like, no, don't say it out loud, you've got your microphone on. And he was like, oh. So basically we sort of like hid it underneath behind the altar. We're like, we'll deal with that later. But it turns out that this maggot was the only maggot in the whole of the big pot of communion wafers.
I thought you were going to say in the whole of the West Midlands.
The whole of the West Midlands. But this maggot in the pot of communion wafers, which is kept in a jar, a screw-top jar, is also kept under lock and key in the church safe. So how on earth it got in there? Anyway, me and my vicar are now calling it the Houdini maggot. It was very exciting. It was one of the most riveting parts of the service that day. And I just keep thinking about it. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can just see this little maggot eating Jesus, and I don't know what to do with it. But apparently the vicar did put it to ground in a nice way, put it in the memorial garden.
Good.
So that was kind of him.
Perhaps the maggot was a vision of some holy thing.
Well, exactly.
So maybe you need to reflect on that and pray on it.
I mean, we have a sort of imminent and almost kind of dirty faith, don't we? So I kind of like that. And, as I've said many times, God appointed a worm. And clearly in this case, there was some spiritual significance to this. I don't know. I'm just rambling on trying to spiritualize something that was just a funny maggot story. Let's move on, shall we?
Yeah, there we go. That's what's on your mind, Graves Lou. Nice to have you back.
Maggot of Christ, given for you.
Oh, wow. I'm sure that's blasphemous.
But I'm sure there's going to be a vision of Christ being like a decaying body somewhere.
Oh, of course, with maggots eating.
Yeah.
And all the maggots have the face of Christ on them, or?
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
Oh, gross. Talking of which, I have a friend who I took to communion once, and we were passing communion around the table. And she took it, and she'd never said the words before, didn't really know what they are. So she looked at me, gave me a piece of bread, and went, "The bones of Christ crushed for you." And I was like, "Oh my gosh,
that's glorious!"
It's in some respects well, no, I suppose it's not theologically.
His bones were not broken.
No, that's it.
Or crushed up and made into wafers.
Did you have a go back and say you're a heretic, or
no? I snort laughed very loudly at the moment.
Excellent.
Oh dear.
Okay, let's move on, shall we? Before we start talking about even more crushed bones and maggots and so on. Jonny and Lou, can you name for me 4 Black British historical figures?
Mary Seacole. Does she count?
Yeah. I suppose she's Jamaican born.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, she counts.
Okay.
Claudia Jones.
Oludua Equiano.
Oludai Equiano, yeah.
One more. Oh gosh, this is embarrassing, isn't it? Because I know what the news article is.
Yeah, I know.
Oh no. Oh, crumbs.
It's difficult when you're on the spot, right?
Yeah, but even when I'm not on the spot, I think I'm sorely lacking, which is the bit that's... There was that Black Tudor who played the trumpet in Henry VIII's...
Yeah, there's a whole book about him.
Yeah, but I can't remember his name.
I can't remember his name.
Right, so the point is that it is hard for people to name Black British historical figures. And this is a Guardian article I'm reading from that says that half of Britons can't name a Black British historical figure. So not even one, right? And then it goes on to say that only 7% could name more than 4.
Wow.
Which is sort of astonishing in one sense, but also I'm kind of not surprised in another sense.
Yeah.
In the US, I know it's a controversial thing for many reasons, and I've heard plenty of Black voices say that they don't like Black History Month because all history is Black history as well, and I think that's a fair point. But one thing that it does do, obviously, is make things like this a little bit more known, a little bit more accessible amongst people like us who are white.
Yeah.
But yes, really, really interesting and important article that says that the UK knows shockingly little about Black British history.
I think that's fair. I mean, I would hope that maybe those in primary school now have a better understanding, but it's often that the historical figures that we know are often the ones that we learn in school and that we pick up, and they're sort of drummed into us, that they've sort of just become part of our long-term knowledge, if that makes sense. They're kind of in our memory bank, and I don't think that I learnt about a Black British historical figure at all.
No, I didn't either.
We learnt about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, but that was probably about it, I'd say. But I can rally off all the kings and queens of England and whatever else.
I can't do that.
It's not really a special skill, Jonny.
And those kings and queens, some of them were directly involved in the slave trade. They owned enslaved people. So that's another thing that this article talks about. It says that most people also underestimated the scale of Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. More than half, 53%, didn't know how many people were taken from Africa by the British. Around half believed the number was 250,000 or fewer, and only 12% of Britons thought that more than 1 million people were taken, despite the true figure being more than 3 times that amount. So, yeah, I think this speaks to the shockingly sparse access to this kind of information. And actually, I have conversations with people quite a lot about issues of race and racism and with slavery as well. And I am fairly constantly, well, not surprised, but shocked, I suppose, in a different sense, with how little people are aware of our own history. Yeah, and I think one other thing I'd say about that as well is it's obviously really important to talk about the transatlantic slave trade, but we shouldn't just focus on that as well, because we want to focus on the positive things that Black British people have brought to our society. We don't just want to focus on, we did this, isn't that bad?
Yeah, and not to deny the vibrancy of the many different cultures that are out there.
Yeah.
Rather than, just going, almost focusing again on white people and white power, going, oh, aren't we terrible? And look at what we've done. It denies the humanity that has been there and is there.
It's also important to remember that, when you speak to Black anti-racist folks doing that work, they're not asking for white people to be guilty and to apologize all the time. What they're asking for is the balance to be redressed, for that history to be acknowledged. Let's take, for example, it was slavers who were paid off when slavery was abolished in the British Empire. They actually had to pay compensation to people who owned slaves, not the slaves themselves. And even after it was abolished, they introduced a apprenticeship system that meant that most slaves had to stay on as slaves for another 6 years. And originally they proposed 12 years, right? So all of this is to do with, again, property rights. It's capitalism.
Yeah.
People don't often make that link between, that inextricable link between the transatlantic slave trade and capitalism, but they are absolutely fundamental to each other. So we're talking today about postmodernism. Jonny's kind of, I don't know, what is it to you, Jonny? It's just your favourite thing?
I mean, it's not. I mean, obviously the Bible and God are my favourite things.
Well, I mean, we'll let the listeners be the judge of that after this episode, I think. But to begin with, we're going to talk about something called paresia. Jonny, why don't you tell us about paresia?
Paresia.
This is an ASMR. I can't even think. I'm so done.
I'm really winding Adam up now. I've just been saying words in an ASMR voice since he gave me some good advice about bringing my microphone closer.
Do you remember the M&S adverts where they had the Fleetwood Mac song in the back? It was like, blew, blew.
Yeah.
This is not just M&S.
This isn't any normal Frank speech. This is paresia. So paresia is a Greek word, and it means frank speech in a very literal way. But it's kind of, in philosophy, come to mean sort of speaking truth to power. And we're going to talk a bit about this, and I suppose how, what it means, what it does, and then how it's kind of useful for us, particularly in the struggle against things like fascism and oppression, and how we can support those with less power. And some of the stuff that comes from it, Michel Foucault, that beautiful turtleneck-wearing French philosopher, he has a book called Fearless Speech, which I found a PDF of it online, so I'm sure others can as well. And it's actually really useful. And for Foucault, it's not too difficult to understand. And also there's a book that I've started reading called Psychosocial Explorations of Trauma, Exclusion and Violence, Unhoused Minds and Inhospitable Environments, which is, the most cheery of reads, by Christopher Scanlon and John Adlam. But it's pretty good. So it does talk about quite a variety of things. And as with any sort of psychoanalytic and psychology stuff, It uses a lot of philosophy and takes things from someone called Diogenes. There's also quite a good episode of a podcast called Overthink, which is a philosophy podcast by two philosophy professors. And we could put a link in the show notes to a description of that episode, all about speaking truth to power.
Let's move on to Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Jonny, who is this week's Saint of the Week?
Or just like we had San Negro Matapakos some time ago now, actually, we now have a pre-Christ or pre-Jesus Christ saint.
You are breaking the rules. You are breaking the rules. I'm sorry. This cannot be allowed to continue. How can you have? The rules were that it had to be a Christian from history. They didn't necessarily have to be an official saint, but they had to be a Christian from history who was kind of cool and did cool lefty shit. And you're coming to me with Diogenes. Diogenes, who pre-existed Christ. Is that right?
Well, pre-existed
by about
Jesus.
400 years, yeah.
By about 400 years, yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. I love Diogenes. I thought he was hilarious. I mean, I wasn't there, but from what I know,
I thought he was hilarious. Pre-existed Adam as well.
Yeah.
Lou, I think we should take a vote on this. I think we should shut it down.
But you had a dog, Adam.
What's wrong with having a dog?
Well, how did you know the dog was Christian?
There's bloody icons of it all over South America.
I'll just draw and I'll write an icon of Diogenes of Sinope.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't.
Sorted.
It doesn't count if just you do it. You've got to start a movement, Jonny. Anyway, it doesn't matter because it's from before Christ was born.
So the communion of saints only applies after Jesus Christ. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, no.
I think Diogenes would be really pissed off if he knew that you were saying that he was a Christian. That's what I think.
Perhaps.
Do you think he'd be really pissed off, or do you think he would just feel a bit misrepresented? Either way, I think there's always a relationality going on with sainthood, isn't there? And if Jonny understands Diogenes to be a saint, then I feel like we should respect that. Adam.
Fine. So it's 2 against 1. Is it?
Only because you had a dog.
Have your bloody Saint of the Week. Go on, do Diogenes. Talk about how he lived in a fucking barrel and how...
He lived in a barrel, Adam. That's a sainthood, isn't it?
He did. Well, it wasn't a barrel. It was a big vase type thing.
Don't ruin this for me.
Big vase.
Anyway, Jonny, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to try not to be angry at your bullshit. Why don't you take it away?
You could just put yourself on mute.
I'll put you on mute, you bastard.
So Diogenes of Sinope, he was the OG of the Cynics, and he lived around 400 BCE and died at the age possibly about 35, maybe a bit younger, we don't really know. But he and his father were actually to do with bankers in Sinope, which is now in Turkey. And there was a scandal of them debasing some currency.
Legends.
Absolutely. Subverting already the capitalist system. And as a result, Diogenes was made homeless and exiled from the city, and his father was actually put into jail. But instead of being condemned and displaced, Diogenes, with the character that he was, decided to condemn the city by remaining. And so he stayed there for a while. But after some time, he moved to Athens, and then he would have likely have sort of known quite a few people there from beforehand. So he would have had some kind of, I suppose, social currency, social power at that time anyway. But instead of living in a house with the people he knew, he decided to take up residence in the marketplace, the agora, and lived in a large jar, a pithos, which, was a sort of big ceremonial jar. In fact, the story of Pandora and the box is actually she opened a pithos. She opened a big jar instead of a box. But that's what he was living in. In the jar, he slept in there, he defecated in there, and he also masturbated in there, as stories go.
At the same time?
Quite possibly.
That's quite a skill, I'd say.
Whatever you're into. I mean, no judgment here.
No, do you know what? I want to move on from this quite quickly.
And Plato was one of his contemporaries. Plato called him a dog, which Diogenes replied to Plato saying, quite true, for I come back again to those who sold me. And Diogenes was really well known for kind of calling everyone out, no matter who they were. And Plato called Diogenes, Socrates gone mad, because Socrates was often thought to be similar in a sense, but a bit more civil. And indeed, this being called a dog is where we get the word cynic from, because kunikos is the Greek word for dog, and that kind of became a word for the movement of Diogenes, because he would call himself a dog and others called him a dog. And it sort of moved on from there. And Diogenes was said to have walked around Athens during the day holding a lamp, which I really like this idea of holding a lamp, looking around sort of for people, for someone. And he said he would be looking for an honest man holding this lamp up to people during the daytime, which I think is hilarious. And then Alexander the Great actually met him, and Alexander the Great kind of requested to meet him and find him. But when Alexander kind of bumped into him in the Agora, Diogenes said to him to kind of get out and move out of his way because he's in his son.
I seem to remember that being a response to Alexander saying that he would basically give him whatever he wanted, and he just said, "Get out of my son."
Yeah, it's like, no, mate, just move.
I love that. I love that. Like, there's no, like, that critique of power in that one sentence. I just love it.
Absolutely. And it was really simple. But then Alexander admired Diogenes so much that he said, supposedly, that had he not been Alexander, he would like to have been Diogenes.
That's simultaneously really humble and like the most outrageous brag. Like, if I wasn't me.
Yes, if I wasn't one of the most powerful people in the world now, I would be this dude.
That's the equivalent of saying you're the best at humility.
Yes.
I think I might try and say that more.
Oh, my phone's going.
Oh, here we
Johnny.
go.
Oh,
Minister Johnny.
Oh, it's the same person from earlier.
It's not even a proper rev yet. Your phone doesn't know that, does it?
I've been authorised to communion, so you know.
Oh, well, there you go then.
By who, Johnny? By who?
Apostolic.
So, thinking about Diogenes and why I've chosen the Saint of the Week, even though he's supposedly not possible to be a saint, because only the communion of saints, according to Adam, happens after Christ being on earth. But Diogenes was a Parisiastes.
God, sorry, hang on. It's just taken me a while to cotton on to what you've just said there, but that is not my primary critique of why you shouldn't have Diogenes as a saint. It's because it breaks the rules we established at the beginning. I don't know why we ever invited you to be a co-host on this, Johnny.
I don't know either, if I'm honest.
I love how Adam is getting all rule-based all of a sudden. It breaks the rules we established at the beginning. Oh, I didn't realise Adam was on for tradition and reason as doctrine, was it?
It's because they're my rules.
Of course, Adam, of course. But he was a Parisiastes, which is basically someone who practices or enacts paresia of speaking truth to power. And I think that's actually a really Christ-like quality, because Jesus, of course, in his day spoke truth to power all the time. And in fact, that's really what ended up getting him killed and put on the cross, because he pissed off the authorities. And Diogenes very much did that all the time. And in fact, there were times where Diogenes kind of risked his own well-being and was beaten up quite a lot. And he would often write the names of of the perpetrators on a board and wear it around his neck, shaming them and kind of really revealing what happened, with his sort of bloody face and things like that. And I think he's a saint because he spoke out against people who did wrong and would kind of call out people's hypocrisy all the time by just living the way he lived. And I think that, to me, is pretty Christ-like.
Okay, fine. Clearly, I've been overruled, so he is in the official Bread and Rosaries canon of saints. When we do a webpage with all our saints of the week, he will be on there, Johnny, possibly with a very large asterisk.
What would his icon be? Would it be sitting in a pithos with his hands down?
Hands down his pants.
Whilst shitting.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what a horrible icon.
No, I think it would be holding the lamp.
Yeah.
Looking for an honest man in Athens.
Jonny, what is postmodernism?
So postmodernism, loosely, reading very nicely from Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge.
That was a remarkably anti-postmodern phrase to use there, wasn't it? Very totalizing.
Source of all knowledge, yeah. So it's basically a kind of stance, or I suppose a load of discourses or paradigms, if you want to be fancy, which challenges a lot of the understandings that kind of come out of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment ideas of grand narratives. And it is associated with relativism. So everything's kind of subjective in some ways. There's no necessarily truth with a capital T. And even kind of giving postmodernism a definition is almost anti-postmodernist in a sense of because that it still fits in with grand narratives type thing.
Can you see why I might object to postmodernism, Jonny?
But it is really, there are really helpful things in it, frameworks and things that are helpful. Yeah. And later on in the podcast, we kind of talk about that and how what we talk about in terms of speaking truth to power is just one type of framework that is helpful for thinking about struggling against oppression and whatnot.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St. George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
I suppose it's worth mentioning as well that postmodernism as a movement has kind of influenced a lot of different areas, right? So you can talk about postmodernism in kind of art, in the arts, really, in film, in sort of fine art.
Absolutely.
You can talk about it in education, in the humanities. You can talk about it potentially, even you can talk about it in science, and certainly in relation to social sciences. The point being that this is an ideology, a movement, if you like, that has influenced our culture in so many ways that we might not even recognize as coming from postmodernism.
Mm.
Yeah, indeed. And it's postmodernism because it's the after what modernism is, which I kind of alluded to in terms of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment stuff. And it's interesting as a general critique, a lot of Christianity is still very much in theology is very much in a sort of post-Enlightenment place or Enlightenment place where there is an objective truth and things like that. Whereas postmodernism kind of doesn't see an objective truth in anything, or at least humans can't see objective truth. So yeah, a lot of the ideas come from Foucault, that wonderful turtlenecked wearing man.
Did you just say turtle naked?
Yes, I didn't mean to say that.
Turtle naked.
Turtle naked.
Oh, totally naked.
Turtle naked.
I mean, he probably would like that because he was a very interesting man, and was out and being a gay man and into BDSM and drugs and things like that way before it was
he?
kind of. Yeah,
that's his big sort of awakening moment, wasn't it, when he got into BDSM?
I haven't read that bit. I need to do some more research into Foucault's BDSM, where he is totally naked.
I mean, he's a really interesting character, and I do like him. And a lot of the stuff about intersectionality, queer theory, and indeed, and feminism and whatnot, and gender theory and stuff like that, uses Foucault huge amount. They rely on his ideas quite strongly, particularly around power. If you want to understand how he uses power and things like that, I think the first book of the history of sexuality is like around page 100, and there's a few pages that kind of explores that quite thoroughly, and that's the main bit in some ways. I mean, those who are scholars and Foucault will probably say otherwise, but if you want to understand it, that's quite a good place to do it. But yeah, in his book, Fearless Speech, he talks about this parrhesia of frank speech, of speaking truth to power. And he says that there are kind of three things that a parrhesiastes needs to have in order to do this. One, less power than the person or group that they're speaking to. And second, there needs to be a level of risk of harm to that individual's own well-being, which can vary from being a kind of disgruntling a friend all the way to actually being killed. So there's a huge, range of that risk or level of risk. And the third thing is that it involves a great deal of courage from the individual to desire truth rather than living in a kind of a false space. And Foucault says this on it. He says that parrhesia is a kind of verbal activity where the speaker has a specific relation to truth through frankness, a certain relationship to his own life through danger, a certain type of relation to himself or other people through criticism, self-criticism or criticism of other people, and a specific relation to moral law through freedom and duty. More precisely, parrhesia is a verbal activity which a speaker expresses his personal relationship to truth and risks his life because he recognizes truth-telling as a duty to improve or help other people, as well as himself. In parrhesia, the speaker uses his freedom and chooses frankness instead of persuasion, truth instead of falsehood or silence, the risk of death instead of life and security, criticism instead of flattery, and moral duty instead of self-interest and moral apathy. Here, there's a sense that morality is more important than one's own comfort, that a certain relationship to his own life. And Foucault also points out the fact that the parrhesiastes does not act out of malice, but rather a kind of desire for better. And you can kind of start to see, hopefully, where this can be really useful in struggling against oppression, because you are choosing truth and morality over falsehood and comfort. And it also has, to me, the sort of Christian part of it is that hope for better. I suppose the eschatological bent that you could put on it.
I suppose some would take issue with that, I guess. I mean, we can talk about how postmodernists like Foucault conceive of the idea of truth, right? And whilst we might agree, with what you've just said about choosing truth, postmodernism has this relationship with truth that sort of errs on the side of relativism. Like maybe there's no objective truth, or at the very least, objective truth can't be known.
Which I kind of agree with, really, because human beings, we are finite, we are flawed. If there is within creation a truth, a sort of absolute truth, I don't think could actually know that. We might have in faith, I believe that God is a kind of truth, but even that, my understanding of God is still so limited, and it's never going to be full on this side of life. And so there is still that relativism in there, and even what God desires, that's going to be relative in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, I think for me, I would definitely err on the side of, there is objective truth, but maybe we don't have access to it in an objective way. Maybe our access to objective truth is sort of mediated through a subjective lens, if that makes sense. But I do wonder whether there's an issue of, relativism hindering any understanding of what Marxists might call the material conditions that we need to kind of have a grasp of in order to pursue liberation.
Why would it hinder?
Well, because you don't have, if you relativize everything, you end up, as postmodernists do, mostly kind of rejecting any idea of sort of historical materialism, definitely watering down class-based analyses of the way things are, all of which can end up with postmodernism taking the kind of symbols, if you like, of these things and almost focusing on them rather than the broader struggle.
I mean, in some ways, a lot of what postmoderns might do is give us a way of explaining how things are so weird and why currently, rather than a way of getting out of it.
I think that's fairly fundamental, isn't it? The postmodernism, because it sort of rejects grand narratives, it kind of almost by necessity ends up focusing on things are bad. Maybe we can give you some ideas as to why and how some of those things are bad, but we're not here to offer any solutions for it, really.
Well, I mean, in some ways, Parrhesia is a way of offering a solution.
Does it offer a solution though, or does it kind of, is that really something that should be on the road towards a solution?
I suppose in some ways it's the beginning of a solution, because in order to get to struggle against anything, you've got to acknowledge that there's an issue and kind of having that frankness, that's frank speech, whether that's be through your actions or through your words or some other way. You've got to kind of show it to people and go, hang on a second, this isn't right. And I suppose it's one of the tools that you use in your arsenal against capitalism, essentially, and oppression and fascism. I suppose, as much as I love postmodernism, I wouldn't say it's the be-all and end-all, and it's the same with any materialist critique. It is going to have its limitations, and you need to draw upon lots of different disciplines, which is why I quite like queer theory, because you can there are no rules in what you can and can't use. So you can just draw upon all the different disciplines and go, actually, no, this tool here is really useful for this particular thing, so I'm going to use it, rather than going, doesn't quite fit within my ideological framework, so I'm not going to use it. So I guess that's the way I
think
it.
My interactions with postmodernism have sort of primarily come through queer theory and kind of expansive feminist discourse as well alongside that. And if anything, I think that's been a really helpful tool. Would you say tool? I'm not sure whether tool is the right word. Some sort of framework that doesn't really have a framework in developing queer theoretical work and queer theologies as well, which has been good. But I admit that that's kind of where I understand it, and I haven't kind of looked at postmodernism in and of itself. It's always sort of been in relation to kind of queer liberation, really.
It's tricky, I think, because I can see how it's been helpful in a lot of different ways, and I wouldn't want to completely dismiss it, but I think for me, some of those ways in which it is sort of fairly fundamentally juxtaposed. And I mean, this is where we could sort of talk about, where people like Jordan Peterson get it wrong, right? Jordan Peterson says that there was a sleight of hand in the 60s that these Marxist academics made, and that they all decided to just label themselves postmodernists instead. And it's like, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on here, because postmodernism and Marxism do not agree on some. They're both kind of broadly left-wing kind of ideologies, I think. At their core, perhaps they've sort of dissipated out a bit, but at their core, they're both broadly left-wing ideologies. But they disagree on some pretty fundamental issues. So when you end up with people like Jordan Peterson saying, these postmodern neo-Marxists, it's like you're saying that this animal is a dog cat, or this piece of food is a pancake pie. Like it doesn't make any sense.
Part of the reason for what happened in the 60s was that postmodernism came about because the hopes and the dreams of what they felt sort of Marxism and that kind of way of thinking could promise seemed to fall flat, particularly after the Second World War and the ensuing, what happened afterwards. And that's why they started moving to other ways of thinking. And also the anti-psychiatry movement fed into it as well.
Yeah. And I think that's true. I think it's important for people to recognise, though, that a lot of these thinkers started writing considerably earlier than we like to imagine. And so, I mean, they're writing quite a bit before, for example, the riots in France in 1968, in which a lot of people were Marxist, avowed Marxists, and very much not postmodernists. And I think, it's really... I don't know if it's duplicitous of people like Jordan Peterson to claim that these two things are the same, fundamentally the same thing, or whether it's just that Jordan Peterson is a bit... I mean, he's not stupid, but
ignorant.
Yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about on this issue.
Yeah. It reminds me, it was quite a while ago, the Magnificast, when they said, are they evil or are they stupid?
Yeah.
And it is a good question. And it's so ambiguous sometimes, and it could be willful stupidity as well.
Yeah, exactly. But then, there's a line where willful stupidity becomes evil, or at least not good. Certainly not seeking truth.
I'm just interested, like, whether Christianity can ever be postmodern.
Yes.
Well, yes. because in and of itself. Because are there any objective truths in Christianity? And if so, how do we move our Christian understanding to a place where it is inherently postmodern?
It is a serious problem in trying to get Christianity and theology to talk with sort of late 20th century philosophy. I'm starting to do this, and in the article that I wrote before the summer, I start talking about this. So I talk about Deleuze and his stuff about ontology, and he uses Spinoza, and Spinoza kind of talks about everything being the same, having this shared oneness, whereas Deleuze takes that and goes, well, yes, everything's the same, not because of it being the same, but because it's different to each other. So every single thing is different to itself. And I kind of agree with that. And I think it's quite a helpful way of seeing things. But I have a kind of proviso in there because obviously Spinoza was a pantheist. So he saw the world as God.
Yeah.
Whereas I have a transcendental view of God. So I see God as separate from the world. And that to me is how we have that truth with a capital T. It's through God interacting with the world. And that's how I bring it together in a sense. So it's the creation may not have an absolute truth, but God does. Coming back to Parrhesia, speaking truth to power, talking about how it relates to Jesus, because obviously revelation of God in Jesus Christ is the best way for us to understand God in our human ways. And that kind of thinking about Parrhesia or frank speech in relation to that risk idea and how it's a risk to our well-being is kind of really obvious in Jesus Christ. And that risk to his own well-being kind of culminates in Good Friday. He really pissed off the authorities who were incredibly powerful, particularly compared to him, and that resulted in his violation and killing. And it's interesting because he is so dominated that he's reified. He's turned into an object pretty much. And his being is kind of sundered, and he's no longer treated as a human, but a kind of undifferentiated body. And that idea of an undifferentiated body actually comes from that book that I mentioned about, the Psychosocial Explorations. But even in the Passion, even in this undifferentiated body, this reification, there's still that Parrhesia coming from him, that his body kind of takes on a new meaning, that through his body being so violated, that we end up becoming the ones that are kind of displaced. Instead of him being displaced, we become displaced. That is what the crucified body of Christ recalls to us, a sort of primary relationship with God in which we are kind of estranged. Even though humanity does that to Jesus, through that doing, Jesus kind of reflects it back to us. It's that, almost like we might say holding up a mirror. And even his sort of saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing, kind of reverberates and resonates with that idea of parousia, and it just kind of exudes out of the passion.
I wonder, one of the things this has got me sort of thinking about is, how do we do history through a postmodern lens? Because obviously a lot of historians do history through a postmodern lens.
I mean, using Foucault as an example, his project is kind of loosely, he looks back at history and how power was before. And he very much looks at history through the lens of power and how power creates our understanding and our identity and things like that. So he calls that subjectivation. But yeah, he looks back at the past and say power was really explicit and kind of obvious years ago. But over the years, particularly sort of in the Enlightenment and afterwards, power has become more and more obscured or occluded. So it's become more and more hidden. And we have to really unpick it and work hard to understand where the power is and who has that power. It's almost like, I don't think he makes this example, but people who are incredibly rich and well off quite often will no longer today wear really expensive looking clothes, but clothes that look like they're not expensive. But
yeah, I get what you mean.
They are, because they're designer. Yeah. Rather than 100 years ago, people would wear, really expensive looking suits that were all tailored and perfectly fit and everything like that, and wear jewelry that was clearly quite expensive. So things have changed quite a bit. And indeed, people who are powerful and rich now will isolate themselves from most people. Whereas before, if you were working for some rich man, they would be living in the big house next door. And you would know where they were and you would see them. But now the extent of people's wealth and power is hidden. And that's kind of, I suppose, loosely what Foucault, that's one of the things he does in his projects. And he looks at things like history of sexuality, punishment and crime and things like that, medicine.
I think his thing about crime and punishment is one of the things that he's most famous for, isn't it? And I remember doing quite a bit on that in my master's and thinking actually that was, for someone who is not the biggest fan of Foucault and postmodernism in general, I remember thinking that was really quite interesting and helpful for me at the time.
But I guess how we do history, it's more through, instead of using a lens of materialism and seeing this kind of grand narrative playing out, this common thread, perhaps, it's instead using a particular lens to examine things and how things behave. I suppose as a metaphor, instead of having a foundation on which you then build your understanding from, you have a particular focus.
That sort of brings me back to some of the stuff I was talking about before that I really struggle with, I guess, in that I think there's a danger in that becoming, well, I mean, you used a word, occluding, in a sense, that kind of can occlude. It can kind of make us perhaps not see how things can be broader. I think this is one of the things, one of the things I draw from with Marxism actually is actually this kind of thing of what one might consider a grand narrative, this historical materialism. I think my concern with postmodernism is that you're going to end up preventing the revolution before it's already begun.
But I would want to say why, or perhaps how.
Well, I mean, it might not prevent it. You might have a revolution. I just am concerned that it wouldn't go anywhere, right? Because if you haven't got a firm grasp on like the broad scope of a class-based critique of history, then how are you going to know what you're even fighting against? I suppose what I'm really interested in asking actually is what your relationship has been or become with Marxism broadly conceived or historical materialism, given your interest in postmodernism.
I suppose, I mean, in many ways, I know more about postmodernism than Marxism, just because that's where partly my interests have been, but also my undergrad in fine art, that was focusing more, well, I focused, and my tutors who I had more to do with, focused on postmodernism stuff.
All I'm going to say is you're kicked off the pod now, Jonny.
So, in truth, I mean, I am learning still about Marxism and things like that, which is particularly helpful for things like liberation theology and understanding that. So I do get you need that materialist critique and the understanding of how we've got here in order to then go, what is the problem and how do we move forward? But I guess my interest with like Parrhesia of Speaking Truth to Power is that I would say it's a kind of tool in that the arsenal or your toolkit, if you were to use that metaphor, a sort of toolkit of things where you can dismantle capitalism. It might just be a spanner, say, to loosen some of the bolts, but it's still useful.
Can I just say, the iron will I'm exhibiting here, with you throwing all these words about and me not to use those words to insult you, like, I feel like I've grown in this moment, so thank you.
You really have. And I'm privileged to be part of that journey, Adam. What words am I using that you're trying to...
Tool, spanner.
Oh my gosh.
I don't understand. I'm really sorry.
Adam's just doing very niche.
How is that niche? How is calling someone a tool or a spanner?
You see, I'm not on your grand narrative wavelength, Adam.
I'm lowering the tone and you're not going to be a part of it. I see.
It's just me being oblivious. But yeah. And actually, going back to the toolbox analogy, I very much see it as needing lots and lots of different ways of doing. Really, it's how I see a lot of creation. It is so varied, everything is different to each other, therefore you need lots of different tools to understand things. Mine just tend to lean more towards postmodernism in many ways, just because I know more about it, and it's easier for me to grasp.
Obviously, you've mentioned your background in art and stuff. This is not a criticism, but do you ever wonder whether the fact that you know, and I think a lot of people probably know more about postmodernism, or at least maybe they see things through a postmodern lens, perhaps not always realising it, perhaps that's because that's kind of the way society has gone when you start to critique things?
Yeah, and that sort of materialist critique, people are immediately suspicious of it. And I suppose if you want to be sort of cynical about political powers, in some ways postmodernism appears less threatening because it focuses more on describing what's happening rather than proposing radical transformation. That's really interesting.
I think you're probably right, actually, yeah. I think there's more of a place of postmodernism in conversation, perhaps, because of that kind of perhaps threatening aspect of Marxism or communism, or because of the association, historical and I guess at points present associations with what that means.
And also postmodernism uses really weird language. I mean, Deleuze talks about machinic rhizomes and chaosmosis and all sorts of things, which makes sense if you know what he's talking about. But if you don't know what he's talking about, it's inaccessible.
Nonsense. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm just thinking in a very kind of like, you know, a far less kind of academic, jargony way, that it's easier to get away with saying that's your truth or live your truth or something like that than it is to get away with saying that's the truth. You know, like if you say to someone, this bad person or these bad people are doing bad things and that's the truth of it, you're going to get a bit more kickback than if you say, well, I see it this way and that's my truth. What's your truth?
Yeah. And it actually is a bit that sort of occluded power, that how things are hidden. And I get really frustrated with it. And I was actually talking with my husband, Seb, about this, how I find it really difficult to be quite subtle in situations that need it. So I'm like, but I just want to say what we're doing and really be explicit about this. But often that's not the best approach if I want my well-being to be okay. Which is in some ways, I mean, I'm currently writing a theological reflection on Parrhesia and how my ministry is a big part of it is being a Parrhesiastes and linking it in with some of the promises I'll be making at ordination and things like that, which when it's done, we can post it online for people to read if they're interested. But I think that's the really important part for me, to be almost authentic authenticity, whatever that is. To be authentic me is to be quite frank about things and not to have that kind of occluded language.
So, Jonny, we've talked a lot about the theory surrounding postmodernism, but how does it play out in your life presently?
And one of the things that I'm thinking about is one of the promises that I'm going to have to make at ordination. And in the liturgy it says, as you exercise mercy, do not forget justice. As you minister discipline, do not forget mercy. And I think things like justice, discipline, mercy, I mean, mercy can be a bit of a problematic word generally, but there's something of that frank speech in there, of embodying or being Christ-like, being a student of Christ or a lover of Christ, whatever way you want to describe it. There needs to be that constant pointing towards justice. And a part of that might be disciplining in terms of saying, this is not right, this is not loving, this is not compassionate, this is not Christ-like. But within that, still holding the fact that, you know, the do not forget mercy part in disciplining is still loving that person, knowing that they are a beloved of God. So there's this constant tension, I suppose, in Parrhesia of going, your actions are not okay, but you are still beloved and still precious.
And how do we hold that well in our communities?
Absolutely. If you can solve that, that would be really helpful.
I'll try and solve it before my ordination, but I somehow don't think that'll be the case. But, you know, we can work together on it, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. Being a body of Christ. What?
I think I'm going to have to put a stop to this, guys. So,
Sorry.
Ecumenical working.
No, absolutely not. Not when there are maggots involved.
The Methodists and the Anglicans are just too different to each other to work together. We're going to call it a day there, I think. So thank you, Jonny, for sharing some of your thoughts about postmodernism with us, even if they're wrong.
Wow. I quite enjoyed just listening in.
You're very welcome. It's been good fun.
And thank you, Lou, for joining us and listening in and asking pertinent questions as well. Neither of you can be found anywhere online.
But it's nice to be back, I have to say, after my hiatus for a little while. I'm glad that our calendars have all synced up.
Well, except Ben's, apparently. So,
except Ben's, who isn't here. Yeah. But it was looking like they were all synced up. It was looking like it was.
Yeah, Ben is now banned for at least, this episode at least.
Yeah. Ben embargo.
Hopefully the four of us will actually be able to be together again sometime soon.
Yeah.
That sounds very romantic, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I know.
And it's been great meeting you, Lou.
I know, it's been great meeting you too. It's been very lovely.
Meeting for the first time?
Meeting for the first time, I know.
Yeah,
We've only just chatted on Messenger.
What?
Yeah.
Hang on.
Crazy.
This is the first episode you've both done together?
Yeah. Bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't even know. Yeah.
And we've hit it off.
Wow, okay, I'll just leave.
Blue hair, blue glasses.
Rallied against Adam.
Taking the piss out of Adam, that's what I like. So finally, there's other people there that can rip him to shreds.
Wow.
Going against the white cis het man.
Well done, Jonny.
We're always the ones who just get it in the neck from everywhere, aren't we?
Too right.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, so thank you both for joining me, and thank you everyone who has listened to our podcast. You can find us on any podcast feed you choose to look at, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google's gone to YouTube now, I think, but basically we're everywhere. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bread and rosaries, Twitter at bread_rosaries, email breadandrosaries@gmail.com. You can find me at Commie, Xian, on Twitter. I'm starting to feel a little bit weird about being the only one at the end of each episode who can actually be found on Twitter. So I might just stop saying that I'm on Twitter or wherever.
It's actually X now, isn't it? So you know.
I'm also on the other things with the same handle, so I don't know.
People can find you if they find you.
Yeah, if you want to find me. We also really, really love to receive feedback. So please do email us, even if it's, to slag us off or something. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you all next time.
Goodbye.
Bye. You're going to hell.
Okay.